Okay, for those of you who are new to this game, I'm Nick Finke from the University of Cincinnati College of Law Library. And this is, I think, the third year that I've presented here on XML. And it's, you really don't have to come to this presentation. All that you need to know, more than you ever wanted to know, you can find at that URL. I will give you the URL again later. That is everything in the world on SGML and XML. In software, standards, bibliography, you name it. See, I'm sorry, but it just does that. We're going to talk a little bit about the background, less than in prior years. I'm assuming that you know a little bit about the background of XML. We'll talk somewhat more about the developments, especially during the last year, and then a bit about where we're going from here. So first, the background. I think in order to understand this, you have to know something about what is now seen as the classical paradigm of SGML. SGML is not all that old. As a matter of fact, the standard is, now that's a mistake, it should say 1936, but it was redone, I believe, in 1997. But it's an ISO standard for text markup, standard generalized markup language. And text markup puts intelligence into text. In order to be able to move around in text, in order to be, or in anything else, you use, the standard that's used is high time, the Hypermedia time-based structuring language. It took, SGML was done in 86, high time was done in 97. It's a lot more complicated. And you can do a lot more than this. Well, we use it for linking, all manner of linking. Unbelievably wonderful things you can do with high time, but you can also, as you can imagine, synchronize music. You can do all kinds of stuff with multimedia with high time, if that's what you want to do. DSL, DSSL. DSL. Again, another standard. This is a style sheet standard. Those of you who are used to using CSS understand roughly what a style sheet will do. For about 10 years, there was no style sheet standard. There was SGML as a markup standard, but if you wanted to create either usually paper-based products from SGML, you had to use some sort of proprietary style sheet. But DSL was finished in 96. DSL is another one of those standards. It is incredibly powerful. There's a query language and all manner of wonderful things. But to date, there are very few DSL implementations. For one reason, because it is so powerful, and most of the commercial vendors have already implemented their own proprietary style sheets. And we're not in a huge hurry to move to DSL. Now, SGML comes from a number of roots. If you need large but manageable documents, by large we're talking about the manuals for a missile ship, where the manuals, if you would probably fill, I don't know, if you put them on this table, they'd fill something like that high. And sometime in the middle 80s, the Department of Defense said that if you get any kind of, if there's any kind of documentation with these, $1,200 hammers that we're buying, any kind of documentation that comes with those things must come in SGML. And that was enough to create a very small but very profitable cottage industry of consultants whose only job it was to create SGML document type generations and SGML editors for people to put together helicopter gunship parts catalogs. And actually, that was the development of SGML. These bullets should actually be a little bit different. This bullet should really be up the top. SGML was done by a lawyer, Charles Goldfarb, who wanted to get the legal document market away from people like Wang. And so they created, I mean, there's a lot of history in it, and where, you know, supposedly it was originally generalized markup language, and the GML had to do with the people who actually did the work, but that's more mythology than anything else. But it is interesting, of course, that it was invented so that IBM would have a document management system. That's why it was invented. So they decided, let's put SGML on the web. Because there was this, for years, there had been this large amount of expertise, these very high-paid consultants who knew how to do very sophisticated markup. And the web came along, and all of a sudden, they discovered that all kinds of people were doing all kinds of things in HTML. And HTML, to someone who knows SGML, is pathetic is a word that comes to mind. And because SGML marks up structure, SGML marks up semantics. SGML doesn't really care about presentation. SGML is about reusable documents that you can put through a style sheet, and it can be looked at however you want to look at it. And so something like HTML, where you don't know what the data is, except by looking at it, but all SGML is concerned with really is the presentation. There's a little bit of structure in there, but most people who put together SGML pages manage to avoid using the structural aspects of it. I mean, headings are put at the bottoms of pages and things like that. So they wanted to take the benefits of SGML, the reuse of the data, the identification of the structure, the fact that as you went along, it could tell you what ought to come next. They wanted to put that on the web, and there were some applications that were built to put SGML data on the web. The one that comes to mind is Panorama from SoftQuad up in Canada. And the problem was that an SGML document needs to have its DTD around, and it needs to have a parser to compare the document to the DTD so that the rendering agent, in this case the web, will know where one element ends and another begins, and because in SGML it is legal to, if you can infer the ending of an element, you don't have to put it in. Now human beings can do that, and parsers can do that, but browsers can't. And it requires that you know what the structure of the document should be, so that you know that if a new paragraph begins, that means the old one ended. And in the beginning, when all of the SGML stuff was done keystroke by keystroke, and where you frequently paid by the keystroke, they felt it was a much better idea. I mean, if we can get away with leaving out the end tags, let's do so. And the only problem with putting that out on the web was it was very complicated. You had to pull down not only the document itself, but the DTD, and usually some sort of style sheet, and usually some sort of thing that told you more or less how the high time elements in the document worked. And it was extremely complicated, and you could get, I mean, it did come down fairly quickly if you had a good connection, but it was more trouble than it was worth. And SGML had a reputation for being very complicated and very expensive. Now, the very complicated bit was, I think, probably something that was put forward by the people whose job it was to try to sell it, because after all, you can't charge $200 an hour if it's something that anybody could do. But if it requires someone who is highly educated, brilliant, and knows the incantations, then you can do that, and that's what they did. But it would have been almost impossible to try to get people to really put SGML on the web for a variety of reasons. So when they had the idea of doing XML, yes?
I'm fairly new to this.
Sure.
What is DTD?
Document type definition. It's a description of the way the elements in a document are allowed to be. That if you have a paragraph where you have a heading and then text in the paragraph, the DTD has a way, a very stylized and machine-readable way of saying that that's the way it has to be. And if divisions at a certain level are chapters, and divisions below that are sections, and divisions below that are subsections, that's also something that the DTD keeps in its structural repertoire. The HTML, there is an HTML DTD. You can take any one of those markup languages and express it as a DTD. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Since SGML was perceived as being complex, they wanted to keep it simple. At the same time, they wanted to do something that was a little bit more than HTML and keep some of the power in there from SGML. And they decided, those of you who've heard it before, instead of trying to work through what was then known as SGML Open, which was the trade organization of the SGML folks, they decided to work within the W3C. They had themselves created a committee of the W3C. It just so happens that the membership of the committee of the W3C looks suspiciously like the membership of SGML Open. But the W3C didn't mind. I mean, these people are bright. These people are hardworking. These people are, know how to get the job done. And they really wanted to build on work already done rather than reinventing the wheel, if they could possibly do it. So that you had, instead of SGML, we called it XML, Extensible Markup Language. That instead of high time, we got rid of high time. And we originally had what we call the X-Link language, and now it's been divided into X-Link and X-Pointer. These are now all the subject of working groups within the W3C. And they have spawned yet more working groups. X-Link helps you to create link. X-Pointer creates addresses. It tells you where you want to go and in a document. And they borrowed this from the Text Encoding Initiative work, and it's really amazing. There might even be a slide on it. And XSL, Extensible Style Sheet Language, instead of this. But that was a model that everybody saw. We're still talking about taking a document and running it through this and ending up with something that is presented to you. So we ended up with the W3C recommendation. Anybody who's familiar with standards knows that the SGML standard is a book that thick. And the XML standard, I believe, was a little bit less than 30 pages. They actually got it approved by the W3C, I believe, in a little over a year. They worked like dogs. And they made it short and simple, and they wanted to make it something that was very hard to be made proprietary. Surprisingly enough, Microsoft is a member of the SGML requires that a document parse, that it actually parse to its DTD. XML does not. XML, you can do that if you want to, but XML merely means that the document, it requires that the document be well formed. In other words, that if an element starts with it, if you have element A and then element B starts after element A, element B has to end before element A ends. They have to nest. The boundaries can't cross. That's the only architectural principle that must be followed. Makes it a lot easier for a browser. Even a browser can figure that out. But what that meant was that all the shortcuts that had developed originally in SGML, and there were many of them, short tag, short ref, omit tag, all kinds of wonderful things that you could turn on in SGML. They're all gone. You can't do things short. You can't do things in a way that makes an application have to think. One of the problems that you had in SGML were things called empty elements, which means it's a milestone, like a page break. The page break just sits there. There's no content within the page break, so there's technically no end tag, just a start tag. Well, if the content of, say it's called PB, or the element PB in an SGML document is declared to be empty, then the parser will look, when it comes across a PB element, it will look back at the DTD and say, oh, well, I don't have to expect an end tag. Well, we don't want to have a browser have to look back to the DTD with XML. And so if it came across a regular start tag, it would be looking for the end tag. Well, there's a special tag for empty tags in XML. And it's this, you start it with essentially what looks to be, is that right? No, it goes here. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I must have been sleepy when I did that. But it's a special kind of tag that means don't look for the end tag. Which then means that documents can be well formed, and they can be. The structure can be terribly complicated, but since you just read it as you go along, you don't have to really worry too much about how complicated the structure is. You don't need a parser to tell you what's going on, and it requires Unicode. This was actually, I think, pushed by some of the academics who wanted to be able to write, well, actually, the academics, and I have to say some of the commercial people as well. It's interesting when an SGML application comes out, the first language it comes out in is English. It may then come out in French and German, but you better believe that it's going to come out in Japanese and Korean before you can blink twice, because that's where a lot of these large SGML documents are being used these days. And Unicode gets you around the limitations of ASCII. You can represent practically any writing system that you can think of in Unicode. International standard, wonderful thing. Okay. XML originally built on the SGML model. Yeah, as I said, remember that model where you ended up with a document at the end of it? Well, it was aimed primarily at print delivery originally with XML or delivery on the screen. It's developed in some unforeseen ways. There's a lot of, say, e-commerce apps that are coming out now. If you go take a look at the XML pages on Robin Cover's website, which is what I pointed to you to earlier, you're going to see some very interesting things. And as I say, it's a good example of what can happen if you get too many bright people together in one room. They'll come up with all kinds of ideas and unusual ideas. And there are all kinds of applications of XML. It's not just, it started off with things like a chemistry markup language. And there were math markup languages. And there were stuff along that line. Now there's, EDI, electronic data interchange, there's an EDI language that's being standardized. There is a forms description language that's being standardized. I think I talk about this in a little bit. Okay, no, we'll go into this. Well, that comes back there. Those of you who have worked with dynamic HTML, the document object model is, it's an API for structured documents. It's a way for a programmer to get his or her clause into a particular element and use it in programming. There is a document object model recommendation from the W3C for XML documents. There is namespaces is a big and new development, and the ways of doing XML structure. Namespaces was something that was developed to allow the simultaneous use of elements from different sources. In the old SGML days, this is something that was kind of new with XML. In the old SGML days, you had your DTD, whatever the heck it was. And if you wanted to change the DTD, you wrote a new one. Or you put two of them together somehow. But you had to have one DTD, and it had to work so that all of the elements were properly defined, and your element building, or excuse me, your SGML building applications would tell you this won't work. You haven't defined this element. This element is not properly defined. It is ambiguous. It could mean one of two different things. It could occur in two different places. Sorry, no, can't do. Go back and try again. Well, that kind of work is fine when you're building large, as I say, helicopter gunship parts catalogs, where you're going to have tables that go for 283 pages. But when you're trying, where the data is somewhat the same, over 283 pages, but as you can imagine, working over the web, the requirements are slightly different. There are very few things on the web that go for 283 pages. And especially since these days, well, I have a 17-year-old son who has developed, I'm sure you all have a person like this that you know, who has developed channel surfing to a high art. And this is the way that we look at information these days, and so we want something that will enable us to do the web equivalent of channel surfing. And we want to be able to, what they did with namespaces, they said is, we now have a method. You can take elements that you want. You've got elements over here. For example, the work that I do. I'm working to publish law review articles in XML, putting together a DTD. Now, there are some things that are specifically legal about that, and there is a perfectly good DTD that's put together by an outfit called the Text Encoding Initiative that does very well for academic text. I mean, they thought about it. They did a very good job. And why should I have to go through, if I want to do law reviews, and redo all of that work? Even to the point of why should I have to put together a DTD? You don't have to anymore. In XML, you can take the elements that you want from any DTD, and you just identify them. You put the DTD that they came from first, colon, and then the element. You can have two elements called title in the same document. An HTML title, I think you're all familiar with, what that means, is different from a title in TES2, which here we're referring to something that actually could occur in a bibliographical, in a bibliographical reference where you actually have author, title, da-da-da-da-da. And so you can have two title elements in the same document if you wanted to, differentiated by the fact that they have a different prefix. It seems fairly simple. The implications are very large. And effectively, it makes customized DTDs easy. XML structure. Well, you can use DTDs. There's a gentleman aspect there. You can use a DTD, and it's you can learn to read DTDs without too much problem. It is just a method that states this is what the element, usually it tells you this is the element's name. These are the things that can occur within that element, and if there's any particular order, what it is. And these are the attributes that element can have. But the problem, what they decided to do instead, and there's been a tremendous amount of work over the last year, and to go through it would take easily another talk just as long as this, on what they're calling these days, it's being called XML Schema. They reorganized, and they now have a whole working group that's working on XML Schema, and that working group has sub-working groups, and there has been one on structure that they've just come out with a draft on structure and another on data types. Because remember back when I said that they made the structure so easy so that the browser doesn't have to have a parser to tell it what to do. Well, that's true. And a lot of people took that as sort of a Declaration of Independence, and they thought it was wonderful. I can write these documents and nobody's going to tell me what to do, and the elements can just flow one after the other, and so long as it's well formed, I don't have to worry, and this is great. And no longer do I have to be wondering why, the parser says this doesn't parse, why doesn't it parse? Because there's extra white space I didn't notice was there, that sort of thing. Don't have to worry about that anymore. Well, the meanies on the on these committees are working to probably enable you, if you want to, you'll be able to constrain your data types much more than you ever could in SGML. This might be useful for people who want to work with, say, database applications and stuff like that. I don't know. And the structure only looks like it's simpler. You will be able to do a lot of stuff if you want to. The W3C just put 2 of these things out as working drafts. What I find extremely interesting there is they have placed at the beginning of the working draft is one of these little notices that says, although this represents the best thinking of the working group at this point in time on this subject, this is an ongoing project, and this is the important language, we will not be constrained whatsoever by what we have put down here. So you develop on this at your peril. You write an application that you think is going to, you're going to get out of the box first, and everything's liable to, the ground is liable to change under your feet. Which brings me to a comment that I wanted to make. I brought this book along for no particular reason than that I happen to be reading it, and it is indicative of a type. You all know these books. The publishers put them out. They're roughly, this one's over 500 pages. It's got a CD in the back. It costs more money than $55, I think. And they've been putting these things out by the gross ever since XML started. The first book that came out, and the point of this comment is to say, be very careful unless you have a large budget to spend on books, because the first book that I saw that came out on XML came out before the XML recommendation came out. So before XML was really baked, this guy put out a 500-page book. And to read the book, you would have thought that XML was Java, because that's what he did. He was a Java programmer. And so I've seen books that say that XML is Java, that XML is dynamic HTML, that XML is JavaScript, that XML is, I don't know. You can probably go into a bookstore with a decent computer section, and you'll find any number of books. And be very careful. Look at the dates. And if it has a treatment of the XML style sheet languages, make sure that the style sheet languages actually existed at the time the book was written, because otherwise what the author is doing is describing DISL and saying this is what's going to happen in XML. And this book happens to be halfway decent, but then it's fairly recent too. Style sheet started off as DISL Lite they call it. Yes. Well, this book happens to be good. This book is put out by McGraw-Hill, and they have their, on the website, the Robin Covers website, there is a long bibliography, and you can generally, what I do, I find the titles, and then I go to someplace like Amazon, and I read the reviews. And if the reviews are mixed, I then look at the book before I buy it. If the reviews all say that it's good, and there are 5 or 6 of them, but if there's liable to be a review that says this book, it may be good if you can program in C, but otherwise forget it. It's worthwhile to look at the book first. I can't tell you who is. There are not publishers. There are not even authors. Charles Goldfarb, who was the inventor of SGML, wrote a book that purported to be the XML standard, and he had a name that was it was golden in the SGML community. I wouldn't buy a book by Charles Goldfarb anymore without looking at it first, because his XML book, his XML handbook, is awful. It's mainly a series of ads. Other people There's a lot of bad books out there. An awful lot of bad books. I mean, if there's something in here that tells me how to do something I want to do, I think I don't have to, you're familiar with that, I think. Okay, this XML linking started off, based on high time, started off as XML linking language. They added some enhancements and they split it up into XLink and XPointer. Now, interestingly enough, and this is true also on the style sheet stuff, XML itself went through in, as I said, a little over a year. These things are taking a lot longer. There is one of the reasons why they're taking a lot longer is that companies such as perhaps Microsoft, Netscape, people who have a little bit involved with this, there's a lot that's riding on how this stuff is defined in terms of what the vendors are going to support. At the XML conference last year, they actually had a session which was so well attended they had to like double the size of the room, and even then people were, standing in the aisles, where Microsoft said that they weren't going to support, I believe it was, they weren't going to support XLink because the thinking in the community was not, there weren't any good ideas in the community on how to do it. And Steve DeRose from INSO got up and he said that he had considered John Paley from Microsoft to be a friend of his up to that point. But he said it's just not true. Microsoft's saying that because they don't want to support it in Internet Explorer for various reasons. You can imagine why. And so that it's very complicated. It's taking a long time for these standards to get through. And one of the reasons is, as I say, that they're having to fight every inch of the way to try to avoid something that will end up being, Microsoft would prefer that the standards not be as explicit as they might be otherwise, which would allow them to have a lot of room to play in terms of the implementation. Other people wouldn't. Netscape, by the way, was playing a fairly straight game, at least as of last November, in terms of saying that they only so much would be supported, but they intended to support it all eventually, whereas Microsoft was not saying that at all. XLink, you're familiar with this kind of statement up here, the href statement, and it's that on steroids. In other words, you can get bidirectional links, which are nice, multi-target links, one-to-many. You can get conditional links, links that work only if something, if something else is true. What have you? And similarly with XPointers, I like 50 ways to find your target. It's, borrowing from Paul Simon, it's really, you can identify something by its, something that's within something else, something that's so many levels down from the root, something that is, you go down to this element and then you walk over 3 spaces. You can climb down the tree practically any way you want to, and in order to identify where it is you want to go. Plus, you've got all the old mechanisms like the ID-ref mechanisms, which is what this really is, where you name a place and then you point to it. Lots of other good stuff. RDF is a resource definition framework. Metadata, very sophisticated. There are about 4 other metadata standards, including the Dublin Core, which is not specifically XML, but it's the Dublin Core is kind of a. I know Steve is going to talk about it tomorrow. Steve, is that right?
Last day.
Yeah, Saturday. Dublin Core is certainly worth listening to, but it's also sort of a lowest common denominator of something like this that gets much more. And all of this, of course, is written in XML. XFDL, Extensible Forms Language, Extensible Forms Description Language. This will be a common language for web forms, but much more powerful than what you can get out of the HTML elements at the moment. HTML, by the way, is being rewritten as XHTML. HTML described as an XML standard. Signed XML. This is enabling people to sign documents. There is a Legal XML Working Group that has gotten together. It was based on a lot of pre-existing work. There is, those of you who are familiar with the works of the work done out in Utah for electronic filing, there is a, you can find URLs to all of this stuff in the various applications, again, on the SGML webpage. The New Mexico Extensible Port Interface, XCI. Excellent work there. A fellow by the name of Richard Hines is the one who at least shows up on the group. They're talking about court filings, using XML for court filings. And the Georgia State Digital Signature Project, a fellow by the name of Todd Vincent, who is actually chairing the Legal XML Working Group. And Georgia had passed the digital signature law and then decided to put a little money into figuring out how to use it. And that's how Todd got working on this. You can kind of see from this that the focus of this group is very much towards the beginning of the life of legal documents. They're really talking about court filings more than anything else. But they talk as if, they say they're developing an XML namespace. Remember we talked about namespaces earlier? Which is, they're developing a set of XML elements to describe legal data. Claimant, defendant, name, social security number, you got it. And they say that it should fit all legal documents. The problem that we find is that since the focus is on court filings, that it's not something that we would necessarily work with the people in this room all that much. Since most of us come from an academic background, this kind of stuff is, I think I'm the only academic on the group. Several other people who are even now sitting in this room, having been approached and asked to spend some time and do some work, were never heard from again. But actually I can see why. Because there's the one thing that's a problem with this group is that there's such a diversity of backgrounds. And it's a very wide spectrum of people, including some people who want to do legal applications but really don't know what they're talking about. So there's a poor problem definition. It's hard. I mean, they're working very hard, and I continue to try to work with them to the degree that I can, but they're focusing on stuff that's early on in the process, and it's kind of like they're saying, well, a legal document looks like this, and I can say, well, I can show you what I consider to be a legal document, for example, a court opinion, and it doesn't look like that at all. They recently they tried to break up into smaller groups, and one of the things that they're trying to do is to aim at different document types. Court opinions were not a document type that was first mentioned as something that would even be worth doing. You know, that didn't seem to me to correlate very much with, you know, the kind of stuff that I thought was that my boss wanted me to do. There's been an attempt to isolate issues. Metadata is one. There are people who don't like the idea of metadata, who don't like the idea of something that would not end up on a document. Printed, for example, if you made the document printed, you wouldn't necessarily put the metadata into the printed document. It's more something that's like a marked record to use to find the document or use to classify it. But it's hard to get people to understand that. Presentation is a big problem. And I can understand the problem. It kind of goes like this. If what you're trying to do is to get a document that is going to be signed by people, and you can make that document look different depending on what style sheet you put on it, don't you somehow want to link that you want to make the document that was signed be the document that those people saw? And The way that it seems to be proposed at the moment is to have them sign the style sheet as well as the document, essentially requiring that this style sheet and this document work together. My reaction to that is, why not use Acrobat? Gets you where you want to go. A lot better than trying to freeze an XML document in this way. There was very little reaction to that when I suggested it. I don't think they liked the idea. But what they were describing was Acrobat done, without all of the technological smoothness that Adobe has built into Acrobat.
We don't like it either, man.
Huh?
We don't like it either.
Great. Where are we going? Why should I care? I think somebody asked me last year, what are you going to do with this? You're going to get data typing out of this. And I think in the long run that can be something that can be extremely useful. It allows for much more sophisticated searching. Right now you look for a word, and looking for a word within a P element doesn't get you very far, but that's about all you can do. You have very good search engines on your websites, but what they can do is sometimes very limited by the markup. Because the markup just tells you what it looks like. If the markup told you what it was instead, you might have looking for a particular name only when it occurs as the author of an article. Stuff like that. Which is what I said, especially useful for bibliographic items. And integration with document generation systems. This is very, something like Hot Docs. But Hot Docs with a non-proprietary back end. Could be interesting. I'm not sure. I think that blinking may come from the fact that it thinks that I'm telling it, I'm timing it or something. Also, this will give you easier web delivery. It avoids the problems that you have with HTML in terms of having to worry so much about making it look just right. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're using dynamic HTML, and you're using style sheets, and so you're controlling your presentation format you're using divs and spans and controlling your presentation format with a CSS style sheet rather than with the original HTML elements, you're doing what I'm talking about. You're just using slightly less powerful tools, because the tools I'm talking about will allow you to do much more than that, but you're on the right track. And if you say, why should I change to XML? If you're happy with what you're doing, stay right there. Because, but of course, when you want to change, it'll be easier. This is the only application that I use for all of my bad mouthing. I use lots and lots of Microsoft applications. I use a Mac. There are very few other applications for things like that are decent for things like the word processing. And Internet Explorer 5.0 for Windows supports some XML features. It's the first regularly distributed application that does so. It uses CSS style sheets, not XSL style sheets, but that's quite all right. W3C provided for that, so you can't really blame them too much for that. And after all, since if you wanted to wait until XSL was done, you could wait quite a while. And now there's no support, because it's CSS, there's no support for transformation, style sheet transformation. In other words, a style sheet cannot be used to actually generate new text on a kind of conditional basis or whatever, but that'll come. And there's no support for X-Link features. But it allows the direct use of XML, because if I serve XML, I've got a couple of applications to serve it with. But they're basically taking the same route that all the old SGML server applications is, which means that you take your SGML and run it through a style sheet and make it into HTML for presentation purposes. And so you're not, the thing about IE 5.0 is you're not doing that anymore. So it's the first time when you really get straight, you're serving XML, and it's the browser is reading XML, not some sort of. There's another little site that I just want to It's kind of amazing. It's really nice. It's this AlphaWorks, IBM AlphaWorks site. If you're not familiar with it, especially if you like Java, they've got some marvelous little XML applications. Remember I told you about that book that said that kind of acted as if XML were Java? Well, there's a reason why. I mean, the man was not all that wrong. And the reason why is that both XML and Java are meant to be cross-platform and relatively non-proprietary. Although, well, anyhow. But the idea is nice. The idea is real nice. And actually, there is a lot of XML work, I believe, on the Sun site. I think it's on JavaSoft site. And a lot of the people who are working with this stuff are indeed from Sun. John Bosak from JavaSoft was the original convener of the W3C Working Group. And there has been a lot of work to create Java tools to work with XML. And I think that's, so I can understand why someone might think that the two should go together. It's just they don't have to. If you don't, if your religion doesn't happen to involve using Java, that's fine. This is kind of like, this is my things to do list, sort of, but I think to the degree that the Legal XML Working Group does get something done, and I think they will. They've got some very hard-working people there. And I'm not sure how much it will impact the kind of stuff that we do in the short term, but in the long term, it will. And if there is an XML namespace that's put together that deals with court filings, it will eventually work itself up the food chain. So I think that it's worth watching what they're doing. However, I think you need to focus on academic-specific issues. That's where we work. Because I work in a library, tend to focus a lot on elements that describe citation and cross-reference, which is, after all, about all that legal documents do in a sort of structural kind of way. I mean, you look at a law review article, it's not too hard to get paragraph elements to describe the paragraphs. The only action is the footnotes. Marking of the footnotes is interesting. And we need to develop publishing standards for things like opinion statutes and law reviews, which is the kind of stuff that we put on the web. I mean, we do in Cincinnati, and I know lots of other people here have really good data, and I never come to a conference like this, but when I run into 3 or 4 people who say, and I'm going to put up X, and what do they do? Again, in terms of, this is all you need to know. This is one. This is Robin Covers SGML XML web page. It's truly immense. You'll notice there at the top, you get, well, just to look at, say, the XML page. This is, you see, you can go, you just get an idea of what that looks like. It goes on for quite a while because that's just the table of contents there at the top. And but that's, if you read that, it's kind of amazing, including. Let me get back there. No hand-eye coordination. There's lots of. Let's see where. Proposed applications and industry initiatives. And this gives you an idea of the, you've got, it goes on for quite some time. All kinds of stuff. And it's really, the Australia-New Zealand Land Information Council, which you could tell us all about later, right? And there's a digital library project, there's an EDUCOM project, there's a structured graph format, Legal XML, the Utah thing, the court interface, the Georgia State project, the web standards project, the HTML threading, open software description format, extensible log format, wireless markup language specification, HTTP distribution and replication protocol. I'll tell you, this wasn't necessarily what they had in mind when they thought of delivering SGML on the web, but it's producing a lot of very interesting activity. And if you are interested in this, you can do a lot worse than spending a few hours just reading through this thing, and you can spend a few hours. Okay, that's pretty much what I have to say at this point. I'd be very willing to answer questions. Yeah. I think so. Let me see. Let me see. There you go. Yes.
You said that what we should do is keep up with the Legal XML Group and also start working on some of these.
Thinking about, I would say, whatever it is you're doing, if you think, if there's an application there, yeah.
Well, A, how do you keep up with the Legal XML Group?
Good point. They won't let you join unless you say you work.
No, I don't want to do that.
Right. So come back here next year.
Could you just explain what Unicode is a little bit more?
Yeah. Are you familiar with ASCII?
Yes.
Okay. You've got what is known as lower ASCII. You've got 128 code points, all of which are assigned. The beginning 30 or so are a bunch of control characters, and then after that you've got the uppercase and lowercase alphabets and the numbers 1 through 0 and a bunch of punctuation marks. That particular character repertoire serves to write English. There is practically no other language. Well, I think it will write Dutch and Hawaiian and anything that doesn't use diacritical characters. But I mean, even to write French or German, you have to go into what is known as an extended ASCII set, which is another 128 above that. Well, what about Russian? Well, there's a way of doing that in an upper ASCII set, but it's kind of a kludge. Unicode gives Russian, Greek, Ethiopic, you name it. It has, instead of having 128 code points or 256 code points, it has 10,000 code points, something like that. You can, more than that even, 100,000 maybe. It's because you can get not only, say, all of the various beautiful looking Indian scripts that are completely opaque to me, Cherokee, if that's what you wanted to do. There's a Cherokee alphabet. Do that, that's in there. And the CJK characters. I mean, all of the Han characters and the Korean Hangul and all the rest of it, they're all in there. At least all the ones that anyone would ever want to use. So it makes it a lot easier. Instead of having to do, right now, in order to write, say, Chinese, if you've ever seen somebody type Chinese, they generally do it two letters and 2 letters, and that gives you 1 character. Like this. That's the general way it's done. Well, Unicode lets you do it in a standard way, and you know that this particular number refers to this particular character.
So the move would be in a word processor to save it, not just in different ways, but save it in Unicode, if it would be available.
It's interesting. Behind the scenes, I believe that Windows 95 supports Unicode. The Mac OS has supported Unicode for a while. Practically, yeah, it's there. Since you don't need it most of the time, you don't care, but it's there. That's the one. I mean, a lot of this stuff you talk about it, and it's not supported yet, and we're all waiting around. Unicode is actually supported, by and large.
Do you see XML as a vehicle for breaking down proprietary document retrieval systems in law, such as Westlaw, Lexis? What impact do you see it having there?
I think the problem is a little more complicated than the markup system. But I think that it will, but I don't think in the way that you're necessarily describing. It's not going to be because Lexis and Westlaw necessarily. See, marking something up in XML, it depends on what intelligence you want to put into the data. You can mark it up to the level that you want. I've seen Chaucer marked up to the morpheme level, so that every grammatical feature of Middle English is described in this particular piece of Chaucer. A little bit more than we care to do with Roe v. Wade. But you might want to do a little bit more than just straight text presentation. I don't know what the vendors are. I ask the vendors what they're doing with this and generally don't get an answer. Although I would be, when Thomson bought West, Thomson uses SGML religiously because it allows for the reuse of information. LCP was completely using SGML. Translating that into XML for the web would not be all that hard. And Tom's going to tell us what they're going to do.
No, I'm actually going to express great confusion. It seems, and I'll probably be shot by the 5 vendor reps and what we're saying, so the vendors themselves are rather confused about how replaceable they are. I mean, for years they've done different kinds of work with these documents that add different levels of guide. There's been stuff like headnoting and so forth and so on. That's not easily replicated in a non-proprietary way because it involves a hell of a lot of editorial. At the same time, they seem to be pretending that stuff that any idiot can figure out about an opinion, like the name of the judge and the name of the parties and so forth and so on, is highly proprietary stuff that no one else can do. Right, when in fact you could put any third-year law student in the country on this and achieve the same result. So to the extent that they haven't added genuine editorial value to stuff, yeah, they're completely replaceable and it will probably happen. To the extent that they have, it would be fiendishly difficult to do. And the problem for them is going to be in sorting out exactly what people are willing to pay for editorial editions as opposed to simple mark.
And actually, one of the things, for example, there are, I think all the circuits, the more recent cases, probably by people in this room, are up on the web in various kinds of HTML markup. One of the things that XML would allow you to do would be to reformat that so they were all done the same way. And it wouldn't depend on, local practice as much. You could do that with it because you can mark up the content. You can mark up judge rather than, bold.
How long on the legal definitions? I mean, we've been talking about SGML for several years now. I'm talking about legal, SGML, and
Well,
but,
I can.
I mean, if we go through and start doing text encoding now, should we use TEI? Are we wasting our time if we start encoding?
This person was not a plant. I've never met him before in my life. No, I've got kind of an alpha version of something that might be usable to do like law reviews and legal opinion. Because, as Tom says, it's not rocket science. Doing legal bibliographical citations, other than doing it character by character, that is not. I mean, there are probably people in this room who can do Perl a lot better than I can, that I will be asking to help, because that's the problem. The problem is getting it marked up in some kind. It's not the DTD. The DTD, for all intents and purposes, is done. Actually, I'm waiting for the Uniform Citation Guide to be done so that what I'm doing will match with that and the blue. But it's still not rocket science. But if the law review article has 400 footnotes, and each one of those footnotes contains at least one bibliographical reference, either direct or indirect. Indirect being, whiz bang at note 22, page 345. Well, that requires, theoretically, that you do a cross-reference to whiz bang. And then, at which point, and you're also bringing along the fact that you're going to page, you're going to go to wherever it was whiz bang pointed you to, but you're going to bring along page 345 as the pinpoint that you're going to. So that you really have to mark up all those things, differently if you're going to use it. And going through and doing that by hand is A, painful, and B, expensive. And unfortunately, Well, I've been working with our own law review, and they're pretty good. Because what I'm trying to do is, I get the documents in Word, and then what I would love to do is to have them apply some styles in Word when they were doing the documents, because I've got an application that will go through and change word processing styles to XML, SGML elements, and even put in some attributes if you want.
As a practical matter, law reviews all believe that they edit stuff to very tight editorial standards, and that of course makes the work of text and version programming that much easier when they do.
They don't.
They don't. I mean, that's the sad reality.
But isn't the way to deal with it to get your DTD established as a standard, and then you have this slave labor force called law review editors.
If you think that the law review anywhere is going to start using XML tomorrow,
well, no, but I mean, but what you do is you have a relatively influential group of people who say, okay, this is the legal academic standard, or the legal standard. It's not just about
that is the one. You're right. Yeah, it was
it's about articles and review things and about opinions.
Yeah.
And then people say, okay, you have to do it this way.
Yeah, if we could get people to mark up the bibliographic references with their little component parts from the get-go, and it wouldn't be that hard to do it if you did it to begin with. Yeah, life would be.
You give them a word style sheet that says, okay, here is a standard.
In reality, man, I don't think they're any different from a commercial operation in this respect. The only thing that's...
Sorry, who's that? Law reviews?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only thing that's in it for them is reduced acquisition cost, right? Because presumably they're getting submissions from authors in multiple formats, and it would be nice if they had only to deal with one. But you also have to throw in, I think, a certain young fogey factor, which says, I'm a student law review editor, and you damn well can't tell me what to do, because I know it. Right?
And you're putting something extra in their job description, which is not relevant to what I mean, all they have to do is get out the parts of a magazine. That's what law review editors do. And so long as they can produce the paper, that's all that's required. And you're asking them to do something different. There's nothing in it for
I'm
that.
not suggesting it's easy. I'm just suggesting if you had, say, 4 or 5 influential reviews, a couple of influential circuits who were adopting something which we all said was a good standard, then I think you'd see something following.
I just questioned whether there's any circuit or law reviews in which you could actually apply that attitude.
Now the people do it.
Well, so there are some law reviews that the faculty have some control over. Like, I could kick my law review and say, you are going to do this because you're students and I'll fail you if you don't. So it depends. So it depends the degree to which faculty has control over law reviews. In some cases that'll be hard. In some
Yes,
cases
but
not
the
at all.
number of faculty also, I mean, you are also not necessarily typical.
Oh, no, I'm very represented.
I'll plug it.
Someone has a real question.
No, part of the discussion. I'm from Australia and I'm working the ASCII people, which is the regions, the LII in Australia.
Yeah.
They're finding it almost impossible to get anyone to give them standardized information in any sort of format. Now they have the slave labor ready, but they tear their hair out in any form. Even for their conferences and then send out a style sheet, it still doesn't work. So
I think what we're going to have to do, the one thing, interestingly enough, actually responding somewhat to your question, is that what I can do with I use DynaWeb, which is a proprietary product to put SGML on the web. The SGML is proprietary, so it's okay. But DynaWeb style sheets will enable me to take if I tagged all the information correctly in those cross-references, I can create a search that I can send to Lexis and get the document. Or to Westlaw. I mean, I can let you choose which one you want. And that kind of functionality might drive people to say, well, it would be worth doing the effort. It would be worth the effort if we can do this.
And I think also it depends on how much they want to put their stuff, how easily they want to put their stuff on the web, so how much they want that.
Well,
whether or not we can get them printers. I mean, law reviews have been putting codes in text forever. I mean, I did it online. It's all damn printer codes. If you can condense the law review printer.
Yeah, but the printer code is nowhere near as much as is required to do a decent SGML job. But yeah, it's The problem is, law reviews, I hate to say it, but, well, we're not exactly here talking about intellectual monuments of Western civilization. And, really, how many people read the average law review article? Is anybody but the people who put up the law review really going to care that it's available online? Yeah, I mean,
If it's on a topic.
If you're looking for something, you want to look.
that's right. But you can do that on Lexis today, unfortunately. And this will be much, much better. But I'm saying that this goes along the line of what Dan was saying earlier, that there are a lot of obstacles. The obstacles can be overcome. And I can sit here every time somebody says something and say, yes, but, and rather cynically, we have to try. I think that it's not going to matter so much that whether people are going to be interested in the functionality, not necessarily in the actual value of the text. And if you show them something, if I can show them, and then I'm really hoping to be able to get this done by the end of the summer, at least with the volume of our law review. But as I say, it takes forever to mark the silly things up. But if you can show them, I mean, that I can hit on this and actually go to Westlaw and get the target of whatever this particular thing happens to be, and if you want, if you could just hit a button and go to Lexis instead, that's not chopped literal. I mean, that would be something that people would notice. It's not gonna, it's not fantastic, but it's functionality that you can't get right now. It's not hard coding it in.
I think it's most people are going to see it as a resource discovery more than anything else. Improve searching, improve metadata, that's the immediate thing.
We may hear the XML in general. Yeah, I think so.
Well, with legal academic text.
Yeah, I was just saying to someone earlier that legal academic text is unusual in that it's taken me a while to realize this. I do a lot of work with humanities text people because they do a lot of markup, more than a lot of us, and it's nice to have someone to talk to. But humanities text people are really interested in the actual letters of the text. Okay? They really care about the actual text itself. Most lawyers don't care. Most lawyers are talking about a concept structure that they're hoping to be able to anchor to a particular piece of text or to a bunch of pieces of text. And so the object, I think it would work better for us if we could figure out a way to represent those concept structures and link them to text than it would be, trying to do exactly what it is lawyers do instead of what they say they do, which is they say they read the text and the meaning just comes forth. And it's the other way around. They read the text and force the meaning in that they want.
It sounds like an AI project.
That's unfortunately what it sounds like to me too.
Unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much.